You're listening to AudioMag, Magazines Canada's podcast. I'm Chris Chambers, Retail Accounts Manager at Magazines Canada. I'm here today with Don Gillmor, the recipient of the 2020 Foundation Award for Outstanding Achievement from the National Magazine Awards, as well as having won the 2019 Governor General's Literary Award for NonFiction for his book, the memoir, To the River. Don has had a long career as a journalist and published author, and he's here today to speak with us about how being a magazine writer has changed over the years and to find balance writing for magazines and working on his books. Thanks so much for being with us today, Don.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
To start us off, I'd love to hear about your path through magazines, and if you want to mention a few titles that you've worked with over the years. I'd sort of just love to hear the story of how it went for you, the history of the world in magazines, if possible.
Well, the first magazine I wrote for, I was living in Calgary at the time, and friends of mine started a magazine called Last Issue, and it was called that because they thought every issue was going to be the last, because they never knew if they could get financing for the next one. But it was a really kind of a wonderful little literary magazine, and I wrote a few pieces for them and then moved to Toronto, and I kept writing a bit for them, but I was then trying to get on here in town, and didn't have much luck. Back in those days, you would send out pieces and you'd have to enclose a self-addressed stamped envelope, and so you'd have these, I'd come back in my mailbox, would have all these manila envelopes that had my own handwriting on them, and I could tell, I was getting rejected yet again. But I finally had some luck in the States, actually. I sent a travel piece to GQ magazine, and they bought it, and then my editor moved to Rolling Stone magazine and asked me to write about film for Rolling Stone, and so I did that for a bit, and then that's when I got on with Saturday Night Magazine, and essentially, my magazine career has been with a kind of small handful of magazines. It was Saturday Night for years. Ann Collins was my editor there, and as well as some others, Diana Simons and Diane DeFenois, but Anne went on to become my editor at Random House. So we've had this sort of 30-year arc, I guess. But I worked, and then Anne moved to Toronto Life. I started doing a lot for Toronto Life. And then Walrus Magazine when it first started, and did with Legion Magazine as well. So I've sort of, I've written for a lot of different places, but those have been sort of my bread and butter.
Yeah, it sounds like relationships are sort of the key here. It's To the River. Your book from a couple of years ago was written following some award-winning work in the Toronto Star about suicide. It certainly covers suicide as one of its main subjects. I guess, do you see writing nonfiction books as a natural extension of your work in journalism? Is that how it's worked for you?
Yeah, I think it has. Because the first, I guess I did another memoir years ago, but it was based on a short piece I'd done for Saturday Night Magazine about my grandmother, and back then, publishing was book publishing, I think, was in a much more optimistic phase. And I actually, an editor at Random House got in touch with me and said, would you like to expand this into a book? And offered me what seemed at the time to be a great contract. So I just said yes immediately. And then I got home and started writing, and I thought, what on earth am I going to write? I sort of wrote the whole piece on Saturday night. Now I have to, add another 80,000 words. And so it was kind of an interesting lesson. I did find a book there, but it was an interesting lesson. And you do see that a lot. Both, I've worked as an editor quite a bit, and you see these pieces that are appear in a magazine, and there's a potential for something much longer, but often it's just something that's like twice as long as opposed to, book length. And it's a real fear. And when I wrote the To the River, I had a bit of that nagging fear of, where exactly would I go? But that one that came out much more organically. I think it became it was a difficult book to write, but I think easier to sort of find that path.
Yeah, you covered my next question, which was how do you know if your idea is a book or a magazine piece? I guess one of the ways is to wait for an editor to call you and say, "How about writing a book from this?"
Yeah, well, that's the best way, certainly. But I think in dealing with people who feel they have a book and they've written something, you can sometimes see that you could do something if you could sell it to the New Yorker and do the sort of 12,000 word version, that might be the kind of perfect organic length. It's just often you see that it would be difficult to find an entire book in something. And a friend of mine who's a screenwriter said that he would go in and pitch a series, and the standard question that the producer would say is, what happens in episode 5? Because he said you usually have this sort of great idea for a pilot, and then you have a kind of idea for what the next episode is. But, what happens halfway through the season? Where do these people go? And he said often it's the same phenomena where you have a kind of an interesting idea, but it just doesn't have the sort of legs that would take you through a whole season. And it is a difficult call. And sometimes I think you just have to actually sit down and write and see where it goes.
Sure. Advice you'd give to emerging journalists and magazine editors at this point these days?
Oh yeah, I get a degree in engineering. That would be my my advice. It's a very challenging time, because I think on the one hand there's greater opportunity than there has ever been, but there's also less money, and so I think it's easier to get published and more difficult to make a living. So I think that anyone who goes into especially magazines or and newspapers even more so, that you have to have a kind of larger program in mind. And I think, I always tell people, if you're writing if you're writing a piece about anything, think of it. Could it be something else? Could it be, a documentary for CBC radio? Could it be a podcast? Could it be a film documentary? Could it, like any of those spin-offs? So we have to start thinking in a kind of multi-platform way if you want to, genuinely make a living at this.
I hear you. You also won the GG for children's literature a few years ago, and have written a bunch of kids' books. Just wondering what took you to children's literature. I think I have a guess, but would love to hear what your answer on this.
Oh well, what happened was I used to live in Montreal, and I had one of those grand Montreal apartments. I had this great office, and I was working on a piece for Saturday Night Magazine about psychiatry, and it was this really complicated piece, and I had papers piled all over the floor and all over the desk, and the whole office was a mess. And I started thinking about how, when my brother and I were kids, we used to share a room, and my half of the room was this sort of neat, orderly half, and then his room was just chaos, And so I started thinking about my brother, and I wrote this book about the messiest boy in the world and how he found, like Wolverines and his grade 3 teacher when he cleaned up his room, and this sort of like way over the top kind of stuff. And at the time, I was living with a woman who was in publishing, and I wrote this in an afternoon. I mean, it's a picture book, so it's 750 words, but I just sort of wrote it down and I gave it to her, and she gave it to Patsy Aldana, who ran a kids publishing company in Toronto. Yeah. And I got a call like 4 days later, and Patsy said, "Oh, we love your book. We're going to publish it." And I thought, wow, that was easy, and I never had another book that was easy like that, and it never ever happened again. But that book came out, and it was kind of fun to do, and so I wrote another one, And I was paired up by the publisher with a woman named Marie-Louise Gay, who's a
Yeah.
spectacular illustrator who lived in Montreal. And we ended up doing, I guess, 4 books together. But I moved to Toronto after a couple of years, and an incredibly weird coincidence. I was going back to Montreal to do something, and I knew she lived there, and so I said, "Oh, we should meet," because we'd never actually physically met. We'd done a couple of books together and loved working together. And so she said, "Oh, meet me at this Van Hoot cafe on Van Horn Avenue," and she's going to give me directions. I said, "Oh, I know exactly where it is," and it was like a block from my old apartment. And so I go to the meet her there, and I see this woman who I realized I had lived beside. She was in the apartment on the other side of the party wall when I lived in Montreal, and you could hear everything through the wall. So I actually, her husband was an Anglophone, and whenever they would get in an argument, they'd go back and forth in languages. Like she'd go into French and he'd be in English, and then sometimes they'd switch. And so she would have heard everything happening in my apartment. And so we ended up knowing quite a bit about each other when we sat down to chat, which was interesting.
Love it. Again, the relationships, eh? Um, so how do you balance your time between your magazine work and your books? I guess what's it look like these days?
Well, it's mostly books, but the thing about magazine pieces, and Martin Amis wrote in one of the forewords to one of his collections of journalism, he wrote, and I thought it was very astute, that he often would take on a magazine piece just to get out of the house and find out something new. Because if you're writing a novel or even nonfiction book, you're often just sitting in your office for months, occasionally years on end, and if someone says, "Do you want to go and, interview Don Cherry or whatever?" It takes you into this other world, and also it's just a nice relief, and plus you get something that's finite. Because the problem with books is, usually halfway through any book, you're in this sort of delicate situation where you kind of go back and forth thinking, this is completely brilliant, and then the next morning you wake up and think this is hopeless, and I should just give it up and start over with something else. And so if you go and do a magazine piece, you start something and finish it, and I think it kind of primes the pump sometimes a bit, and can get you through those sort of difficult humps when you're in the middle of a book.
Sure. Just the citation for the 2020 Foundation Award for Outstanding Achievement from the National Magazine Awards. There are a lot of references to your work in mentorship. How did you? I'm going to Eleanor Wachtel it. Don Gillmor, how did you become so active in this area?
I think I'm trying to think what the first situation was, but I got involved in teaching, and some of it was just one-on-one, where someone would say, "Can you look at my manuscript?" And I would often do it just because I remembered, when I came to Toronto, I didn't know anyone, and I wanted to get into publishing or magazines, and it just felt like there was this sort of monolithic wall that people in the know were on the other side of it, and I had no idea how to get over that wall. And when people would kind of reach out to you, any kind of act of kindness from an editor, Jocelyn Lawrence at Toronto Life magazine, took me to lunch. I'd been sending her all these proposals that they never bid on, but she finally said, "Why don't we meet for lunch?" And to me, it was like this. It's like walking into the land of Oz. I just, saw the inside of Toronto Life, and then we went to this nice restaurant, and I still hadn't actually published anything with anyone, but I just saw this life, and the fact that she kind of encouraged me and, pointed me in certain directions and told me like how to pitch and what not to pitch and things I didn't really have a clue about. And it was so helpful. And so when you run into people and you can see that there's potential here, but they just don't know how to kind of they were in the same situation that I was in, and you sort of want to help facilitate that if you can. So, I've done quite a bit of teaching, and in fact, I'm heading up to I teach at a writing retreat on the French River, about 4 hours north of Toronto.
Oh, nice.
That's usually held in May, but because of COVID, has been bumped to October, although this may be kind of frying pan fire sort of situation.
Right.
We'll have to see if it still goes ahead. But it's a wonderful opportunity to go up, and there's people up there who often have an idea for something and just don't know how to get started. And it's enjoyable to help people kind of get past those humps.
Sure, yeah. Oftentimes there's a lot of advice for journalists just starting out. What advice would you give folks who maybe have a few years experience but aren't considered veterans? How can they continue to improve their writing skills and expand their experience?
Well, one of the things I would advise is to aim high. I mean, in terms of, there's people that are able to make some kind of a living with, smaller magazines, and which is great. And but I think, it's good to be, when I was, first writing for small magazines in Montreal and out west, often the editor would be a friend of mine, and you could just sort of send something in and they'd make a few comments. But to go through a kind of rigorous, to suddenly, go to GQ or Rolling Stone or Saturday Night, you just see this other process suddenly, and you realize that you have to be, you have to be better than you thought you had to be. And it sort of forces you into another world. And I think that can be really helpful.
Right.
So, and I would say also to, because the market is, I think more challenging now, is to, wherever possible, try and sell to places in Britain or in the U.S. or even in other countries.
Do you think that helped to open doors for you, Don, having that early success with such big American magazines there? Do you think that it's the classic you're only a successful Canadian when the Americans are when you're found by the Americans? Was there that going on, do you reckon?
Well, maybe a bit, but the Saturday Night experience was kind of serendipitous, because what happened was I was working on at the time I lived in Montreal, and I was writing a nonfiction book about Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was the psychiatrist who took CIA money back in the 50s and 60s and was performing these very aggressive experiments on patients that he had, lots of electroshock therapy. And so I was researching this book, and Anne Collins was writing the exact same book. And so we would bump into each other at, there were certain events where there was like a protest on Parliament Hill, for example, and various things. And so we would bump into each other a handful of times, and we ended up, we'd sit and have dinner and chat and became friends. And then after our books came out, and she won the Governor General's for hers, and I didn't. But then, she got a job at Saturday Night, I think, right after that. And so I had her as this connection, and I pitched to her. And that was back in the day when, I think the nature of personal relationships was different back then, because she had a fair amount of autonomy, and I could phone her and say, I'd love to do this piece about these farms that are going under in southern Manitoba, and I know a guy who has a farm down there, and I would just talk to her on the phone for 20 minutes, and then she'd say, "Oh, it sounds terrific. Why don't you go and do it and let me know how it's working out?" And so when I actually had to write not that long ago, I pitched something to Walrus, and it was to someone I hadn't worked with before, and they said, "Oh, can you write this pitch up?" And I thought, I actually haven't written a pitch in decades now, and I can't remember how to write them anymore, because I'd been so lucky with these sort of personal relationships. But there is an advantage, though, to having to write a pitch, because it does force you to think in much more concrete terms, because it's the same sort of equation as the magazine article, the book. Sometimes you have this sort of whim, it's going to be a great feature, and then if you actually write the proposal, you realize the entire piece is sort of in the proposal, and it doesn't actually go much past that.
Gotcha. I mean, you've touched on some change, some of the changes. I guess aside from the changes resulting from COVID-19, what would you say are some of the biggest changes in journalism over your career, or more recently?
Well, I think the difficulty in finding both advertisers and audience. And which kind of go in lockstep. I think that's a big problem, because financially, features are paying not much more than they were paying 30 years ago, and it's a real problem. And I think the other thing in magazines and in magazines and books as well is, marketing has a more critical voice than it once did, and what they want is something that's going to, attract eyes. And so I think you could see in magazines sometimes, you'd have this sort of, it was a kind of journalistic conceit where you'd kind of create a problem, or you'd kind of, you'd make this sort of mountain out of a molehill and say, well, there's a crisis in, the school system in East Riverdale or something. And because you heard like 3 mothers complain about it at the grocery store, and then you'd be sort of try and turn that into something. And I would see that with magazine pieces over the years, where you could tell that there wasn't really much of a controversy here, but there was a sort of, I think, an impetus to try and create one, to essentially to produce a marketing phenomenon out of something that wasn't that fascinating.
Interesting, yeah. Based on your experience, do you have any predictions for how the magazine industry will continue to evolve?
It's so hard to say, because I mean it's at a difficult juncture right now. But I remember there was an interview with I'm pretty sure it was the editor of the New York Times, who said when they were putting everything online, this would be like maybe a decade ago or so, and that one of the things they were finding, what they were worried about was that people would only look at short pieces, because they'd be reading them on their phones in the subway or in a bank lineup or something. And he said they found the opposite, that they were having these sort of 10,000 word pieces on Afghanistan were getting more hits than the short piece about how to lose weight or something. And so they were surprised that there was an appetite for long form journalism, which I thought was very encouraging, because in a way, I think that's where magazines shine, and what they do better than anyone else is that sort of long form analysis of a phenomena. And I often use, there's a piece by Robert Stone, who he wrote for Harper's in '89, and it was, he went to the Republican convention in New Orleans when Reagan was stepping down and Bush was kind of assuming the mantle. And I remember buying the magazine, way back then, and thinking, that's when every network was at the convention, and every newspaper covered it to death. And you'd think, what's a guy going to write that's going to be pertinent? And it comes out in January, and the convention was in November.
Right.
And you think, what's left to say? And the piece was just extraordinary, and it really kind of, it went places that you can't really go in a newspaper, and you certainly can't go, on live television or radio, which was a kind of analysis mixed with a bit of memoir, because he'd lived in New Orleans and knew the city intimately. And it really kind of, I thought it was the single most kind of powerful and cogent thing that had been done about the Republican convention. And I think that's where, if we lose magazines, that's the most valuable thing that will have been lost, I think.
Good stuff. Hey, thanks. Thank you so much for joining us today, Don. It's been great to speak with you. I guess this is the famous question that I've asked in my other two AudioMags. Do you have anything to plug?
Well, I guess not exactly. Although it did there, I do have. There is actually another piece about suicide coming out in Zoomer magazine.
Okay. Look out for
next
Zoomer.
month. Because yet another friend of mine had taken his life, so it's a bit about him. He's a jazz guitarist, and but that's the only thing that's on the horizon. Everything else is half finished. I've got half finished manuscripts that I'm actually staring at right now, so it'll be a while before I can plug them.
Well, beautiful. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review AudioMag on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow Magazines Canada on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Mags Canada, and on LinkedIn as Magazines Canada for more magazine news and resources. Hey, thanks so much for listening, and thank you again to Don for joining us today.
Well, thank you.
AudioMag is a Magazines Canada podcast produced by Messenger Bag Media. We recognize the funding of the Canadian Department of Heritage through the Canada Periodical Fund.